From CRI Simple Numbers, this is Profitability Playbook, the Simple Numbers Podcast, a podcast for those who champion market growth and anchor the nation's economy, small businesses, and entrepreneurs.
All right, episode number 3 of the Profitability Playbook, a Simple Numbers Podcast with Brandon Gray and Greg Crabtree. We're going to talk about getting profitable with what you have. You're going to hit some gross margin talk. We're going to hit some labor efficiency, and really, discuss how to get that business to that optimal profitability level. Because in order to grow, that's where you need to be. You don't want to grow something that isn't as profitable of where you need it to be. Makes total sense, right? So, Greg, why don't you kick us off with that line of thinking and get the ball rolling?
And this is a topic that, certainly is more hot at the moment, given, a challenged market condition for many businesses. But as we always look at it with our clients. I mean, this is a play that we look at all the time with a business that's struggling. And, the reason why I don't think getting profitable with what you got is a market condition issue. It is around, why would you grow a business that's not profitable? Now, I get it. We're talking about businesses that are past startup stage. You're already, at least past $1 million of real revenue, for your business model. You're growing. And I get, and we'll talk about in future podcasts, this idea of investing in your business through your P&L, a concept that I call launch capital that I talk about in the Simple Numbers 2.0 book. But we're talking about in terms of the activity that you're doing. Just kind of think of doing an adjusted EBITDA calculation of your business as it's running today. What is, if I just take care of the business that I have, am I profitable? And you look at that. And if you're not meeting, the minimum profitability standards of that, you've got to make some decisions about that. And we keep working on ways, and kind of my favorite approach to discerning that, right now, is we have to look at the marketplace and really get you to, the first thing in this getting profitable what you got is I need to get you to understand what gross margin is, not what revenue is. So in the Simple Numbers philosophy, if you take revenue, everybody starts with that. That's the beginning number of math. But revenue in a lot of business models is really just a pass through. It's you're collecting money and handing it right back out to a subcontractor, or buying materials, or passing through a product. And so what we really want to get to is understanding cost of goods sold before there's any labor that you control. Labor being a W-2 wage employee or an individual that you might subcontract with. I'm not trying to be IRS compliant with the concept of direct labor. I'm trying to just focus on, hey, these are individuals I control, and we're not talking about, whether or not they should be a W-2 or a 1099. That's a discussion for another day. But that's direct labor. But we don't count that in cost of goods sold. So I've long since held the classic error in 99% of all financial statements prepared by CPAs is we're mixing labor with something that's not labor. And one of the foundational principles of Simple Numbers, never, ever, ever mix labor with something that's not labor. And that is just a foundational principle, because labor is the only cost that comes to work every day with an attitude. It has some good days, it has some bad days. And so once again, if I don't isolate it and hold it accountable to its key metric, I'm just, flopping in the wind. I just, don't have anything to measure it against. And once we started down that road of looking at labor individually, the aha moment came and said, you know what? Gross margin, revenue minus non-labor cost of goods sold, is actually the true economic top line of a business. I mean, that's actually the real revenue number, because if I sell stuff or if I pass through other subcontractors, the dollar amount I have left over, that's the value add that my business generates. That is the market's respect for the value that I provide. And if the market isn't respecting you, you got to do something different. Either I didn't charge enough, I didn't deliver it effectively enough. I didn't actually I may not have even done what the market needed me to do, and I missed an opportunity. And so it's really starts with gross margin creation is that first kernel of activity that you've got to do to improve the profitability of your business. But then the second very simplistic measure is, when I wrote the first Simple Numbers book in 2011, we just used this overall labor efficiency ratio. So we take all labor, I'm from the South, so I call it all y'all labor. So take all labor. I don't care if it's management. I don't care if it's direct. And you look at gross margin relative to all labor. Now, when we go into a planning session, the first thing we look at is we go back in time of your gross margin to all labor and see when was it at its best. Because if we look to help you fix your business, that's the first easiest step that we can do, is because, well, you've done it before. Why aren't you doing it now? I can win that argument the easiest. Now, if you've never done it before, that's a little different argument. We've got to test the theory to say, well, you might have something that the market wants, but either you can't produce it cost effectively enough, or you're just not charging enough for it. And you got to get that piece of it right. The fascinating thing to this is about 90+% of the business models operate off of one standard, two. I want everybody to remember this. Everybody remember the number 2. Got it? Okay, what does two mean? Well, 2 means I need $2 of gross margin for every dollar of all y'all labor. I mean, I guarantee you, I mean, we see it time and time and time and time again. Now, the reason why I want to start there before we start breaking labor between direct and management, and taking management labor and breaking it between management labor and sales labor and other functional components as you get to be a bigger business, it's a great starting place. I've got a $50 million manufacturing client that literally they only need to know one number to manage the profit target of that company. They need $2 of gross. They need to sell $2 of gross margin for every dollar of all labor every week. That's it. Everything else works in their business. That's the pace that they have to stay on, and that's the pace that says, if I sell more than $2 to that labor, it's a predictor of I've got to be, telling my HR department I need to be adding more labor because we got to have more manufacturing lines to be able to produce more product. If I don't sell the $2, I got excess labor. Can I skinny up one of the lines? Can I stop producing the less efficient, products, and maybe either charge more for those products, or which improves labor efficiency, or, do we need to stop doing it? Do we need to have a layoff? Do we need to trim labor and get back to, what we know? And it's a marvelous number. And so there's a handful of the 2 that really stick out that are, there's 3 that stick out that are different than the 2. One is retail. Our retail clients operate off of about a 2.5. If you're a distributor, you operate off of a 2.5. If you're a union labor shop, or HVAC contractors, electrical contractors that are union, they need a 2.5, just because of the extra load of union cost. We call it simple numbers for a reason. I wish it was more complex. We could charge you more for it, but that is, in terms of the P&L, we can get to that number. Now, there are some businesses that can operate below a 2 and be okay. They're just not very exciting. If you get into the staffing industries with, I'm moving a lot of labor and at a really low, like the commercial cleaning industry is a great example of one that, you're not going to get to a 2 in commercial cleaning. It is so commoditized that you almost have to look at it as, it's really about my management labor relative to the margin after my direct labor is really because commercial cleaning is essentially a staffing model, kind of business model, that exists. But that really becomes the first thing that I've been able to get people to be successful, to get their eyes open and go, wow, okay, that's really where we need to aim for it and make it work.
So, like you said, we try to keep it simple from that standpoint. I was speaking to a group yesterday and said there's 2 numbers you need to know: gross margin dollars and labor efficiency. And it just plays out time and time again. So then the next thing kind of becomes, All right, great. I know what those numbers are. Know perhaps what they should be. What are some things that we can do that will help us get there? So let's start with gross margin, since that's the one that we're kind of looking at in terms of our real revenue from that standpoint. So what are a handful of things, and we can go in pricing on another podcast. That'd be a good topic for us. But what are some things that we can do, just kind of off the cuff, kind of some of those easy moves you can make to increase gross margin?
Well, what's interesting is I did this yesterday with a client that I was doing a planning session with, and I, and this was a brand new concept to them because they were a construction contractor. They do renovation work, and they'll do some outdoor renovations, whole home additions, bathrooms, all. So they got several different lines of things that they do, and one of the things that we talked about was a brand new concept to them, was saying, listen. All right, when we're recording this, we're at the end of August, so we're 2 days away from the first day of September. And I said, here's a brand new concept for you. You actually can estimate your labor for September right now within a very small. They don't do a ton of overtime, so they have a pretty stable labor force that they've got to go feed with business. I said, now we've done the work. We have we have essentially looked at what they're a classic example of they need to be a 2, no less than 1.9, but really 2 is where we want to be on that total labor efficiency ratio. So your target for the month of September in gross margin is your labor times 2. Now, here's where the challenge is. They've never tracked gross margin production throughout the month. And so we had a great discussion of going, well, it's not just because they haven't ever done it doesn't mean they couldn't do it.
Right.
And what we came down to is they're very disciplined in doing a very detailed estimate for every job. They literally know the labor they can know the labor efficiency ratio of every job. And so I said, well, a great way to estimate gross margin is assuming every job runs based on according to the estimate. We know it doesn't, but a good rough estimate of, did my team show up and push enough stuff past the cash register every day? Take the labor times the estimated LER for that job each week, and did it work? And and it's like the light bulb went off. I mean, they had the data right in front of them and they only run like 25 jobs in a week anyway. So it's not, you're taking 25 math calculations that would take somebody less than a half an hour to calculate, to have a reasonable estimate of, guys, did we do enough this week? We only got 3 more weeks to go in this month. Pick it up, or, hey, great job, do it again. 2 weeks in, okay, we're halfway through the month. Where do we stand? 3 weeks in, where do we stand? And this is a concept that I learned years ago from Jack Stack with Great Game of Business, which, if anybody's not ever read Great Game of Business, highly, one of the top business books in all the time. And great concepts of teaching your people simple metrics to keep them focused, to make sure don't let any daylight go wasted of getting stuff past the cash register, because we are in, no doubtedly, a labor productivity crisis in the U.S. economy right now.
So one technique I've seen with that, to kind of just piggyback on what Greg was saying there, was an HVAC company. And they set their target of what they would need to have based upon the outlook of jobs and what have you there. And then that also gave their sales team some good standards and goals that they needed to go and because at the end of the day, it's about dollars. People get hung up on what percentage did I sell it for. It's like, no, it's about how many dollars can you bring in. I can't spend that percentage. And so very clearly the sales team would know going into a week, hey, guys, we got a hum here at the end of this week because there's just not a whole lot going on. You need to go find some dollars for us. And so they could adjust their approach, maybe the target customer and what have you a little bit there. They could call back on some people that maybe they'd left quotes for earlier. They could do some different things versus the weeks in which it was like, hey, guys, we look pretty good. Next 2 weeks are booked really solid. Go swing for the fences. Let's see what we can bring in from that standpoint. And so it really was a connection of sales and operations, which many times is missing in most companies.
Well, I always like to remind people is that, be careful of managing by percentages because you can't spend a percentage down at the grocery store to buy groceries. And we see this all the time when people get hung up on a target percentage, and I get it. I'm fine with having one, but don't miss the opportunities. And we showed these guys yesterday. We got their job list and stack ranked it by highest gross profit, to lowest, and best LER to lowest LER. And what they started to realize was, the jobs that, they were basically just passing through some margin on equipment, that gross margin percentage might have been low, but it didn't take very much labor to deal with it. So that's almost a freebie because in their world, they stay ahead on the cash side. So they get deposits up front, they get paid quickly, on final delivery. So they don't have any cash invested. So I can do low gross margin activity when I'm not carrying the load of the cash. But that ratio, and it was, like I said, it was really just like, their eyes open wide to see that the fact that it's about this ratio of gross margin dollars relative to direct labor just floored them and going, wow, okay, well, they now see it. They now know what good looks like, and they
Right.
now know what bad looks like and how to avoid it.
Hey,
So
Greg,
that
in the simple numbers P&L, we obviously, start at revenue, less non-labor cost of goods sold gives us our gross margin, direct labor, and down to contribution margin. We have a lot of businesses, that are flexing labor, that have, COGS that are all over. And what is the role in contribution margin in all this in terms of helping those businesses understand that, hey, we might have to flex labor at times. Think of like a restaurant, for example,
Mhm.
where, they're flexing labor and we got constant moving margin. Talk about contribution margin and that role in helping us get to profitability.
Well, I mean, contribution margin is what many people would call gross profit, and
Hmm.
because it is after non-labor COGS and it's after direct labor, and so, but we like the term contribution margin because is a word that is clean in that it represents a subset of an economic activity. And so we wanted to give it a name that was distinct from gross profit because the word profit is confusing. And I give credit to Vern Harnish. When I wrote a chapter for his Scaling Up book, he was the one that actually made that comment that stuck with me, and I certainly appreciate it. And that's something that makes a lot of sense because he said people confuse the word profit any way it's used. They think that it's the bottom line. So I would encourage people, we really like the cleanness of a gross margin and then contribution margin structure of that, what we call the business engine. There's only 3 data points in the business engine: revenue, non-labor COGS, and then direct labor. How simple can you get? And 90% of your business decisions will be based on those 3 numbers. And when you get to contribution margin, it is the production of a contribution margin dollar, and not the percentage, the dollar that is the most important. And then secondarily, how you know that that's a good number is contribution margin relative to management labor. That is the big lever. If your management team isn't pushing through the appropriate amount of contribution margin for every dollar that you have on the management team, that's actually where the surgical strike goes, when we look at fixing a business. And when I do my presentations, I go through this presentation of I can cut or I can grow when I'm not profitable. And so the first step of the process is, we say, here's the contribution margin that you have. Well, how much labor do you have to cut to get profitable? And and it's like that shocks everybody. And I said, well, all you got to do is, get everybody line up, hold a little sheet of paper in front of them, put their annual salary in front of it. And I mean, we can quantify, here is how much management labor you have to cut if you take the approach of cutting to be profitable. So that's step one. And just line everybody up and see who goes. Well, yeah, no, 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 no. We need everybody. Yeah. Well, great. Okay. Well, let's do the other math. Let's say if I don't give out any raises and additional compensation to add people or anything in management labor, I got to hold it constant. It's at the cap. So how much do we have to increase contribution margin to get profitable with what we got? And then that's the next step. And if it's a reasonable number that I have market capacity, available sales, I can, and I'll, will allow you to hire direct labor people to scale it, to grow it. But you now can quantify, here's how big you got to get to. And it's just an eye-opening experience. And the reality is, and Brandon and Mike, you guys do this, with your clients as well, some stories of people that you've done this with. Once you look at the cut and you look at the grow, most of the time people are going to do a little of both at the end of the day. But I will tell you that it's more highly, it actually ends up being, you end up cutting more and raising prices are the two most common things to get there, rather than actually get more activity through to solve the problem.
Yeah, one of the things that you always have to do, and to everyone listening, and when we work with our clients, on our consulting engagements, our initial planning sessions, one of the first things we do is go through that business engine and we start at revenue. Hey, how are your sales? Have you increased prices? And we work our way down to gross margin. And hey, have we gained any COGS efficiency? Are we checking in on those vendors? What have we done to improve that margin? And after we analyze labor using the labor efficiency concepts, it's like, hey, what is that output of our engine? And is it getting better? Is it getting stronger? Because if it is, and you're continuing to improve that, you now can look and set the targets to say, hey, this is what I have left to run the business and get the profitability. And then you can look at those expenses down the line to help. So, great talk there on contribution margin being that clean number on the P&L.
I'll tell you a couple techniques that we've had some clients have success with as of late, and I think they're timeless from that standpoint. But nonetheless, we're talking about kind of that gross margin target. Well, if you kind of look at it in terms of, well, this is what we have coming in over the next 2 weeks, and in a lot of cases, moving that number is a little bit more difficult than perhaps moving the labor number. And so it's that concept of what we call flexing or right-sizing labor from that standpoint. So I'll give you an example of a wholesale business that we work with, and they're looking at what their gross margin is going to be this week. They kind of know it's somewhat set. They then know what their labor efficiency target needs to be, so they just have to manage their labor to fit within that spend. And so it looks a lot like, for sometimes where it's a light week, they kind of go, hey, any volunteers that want to be off on Friday? And you'd be amazed whenever you ask your team that. They're like, so you're telling me I don't have to come to work Friday? No, well, let's be clear. You're not going to receive any pay for Friday either, but you don't have to come in. Oh, great. I'm cool with that. And I just, every time we have a client that implements some of those things to where they're like, hey, we're going to work 32 hours, 24 hours. Any volunteers to do that? We're going to work half a day on Friday or something like that. It's amazing. It's almost a morale booster in some cases. And so I was discussing this with a group yesterday, and one of the people mentioned, hey, we're in a difficult position, not really able to do a lot of raises for the team. And one person came to him and said, hey, as opposed to a raise, can I have more time away? And so that person works a 4-day work week. And it's one of those things, you just got to be active about managing it. And a lot of our seasonal businesses use that because, hey, when it's prime season, you're gonna work overtime. There's gonna be a lot of stuff going on, but then whenever it's not, okay, well, that's some time to take some time away from the business. And so, nonetheless, get creative on how you use that and flex your labor.
Yeah, and it sounds lovely that you can flex it, but you got to work to flex labor. And there's certain industries that flex doesn't work in because that person has a higher consumptive demand that they need that compensation.
Right.
But in a lot of the fields, you're exactly right. There is some people there that says, listen, I value a day off more than I value another day of work, and and that person can certainly work well. So you've got to deploy all of these things, and sometimes you actually have to change. You might even have to change up your team, where I specifically hire towards those people that have a little more of that flexibility, in their schedule, versus that person that I got to feed 12 months out of the year, whether I have the work or not.
Yeah, excellent.
Well, let's kind of recap here. Make sure everybody, kind of understands, because these are two kind of foundational principles that are really important whenever you look at your business and you're not where you want to be from a profit standpoint. I said there's two key numbers. You're looking at your gross margin dollar production, which is revenue less your non-labor direct costs that Greg mentioned a moment ago. And then we're looking at your total LER, as Greg put it, the y'all labor. I like that one. So that typically needs to be in the neighborhood of a 2. You take your gross margin divided by total labor. If it's not around a 2, then, okay, let's go find when we were at that level. What did our business look like then, and how do we get back to that? So
yeah, and one thing I would add to that, so, and we may go in this a little deeper in future podcasts, but, in terms of setting profit targets, now profit target to us ultimately is, you should have the right profit number relative to invested capital. That's the fine-tuned, perfect, can't miss calculation. But in general, I'm going to give you, 2 rules of thumb. So the first rule of thumb is you got to answer this first question. Is your gross margin percentage to revenue higher than 40% or lower than 40%? So we kind of look at that 40% gross margin level is kind of a demarcation of, if you're below 40% gross margin, you're a low gross margin business. If you're above 40, you're a higher gross margin business. If you're higher than 40% gross margin, your minimum profit target is 10. My target is 15% profit to revenue, and 20% is kind of your stretch. So that's kind of where you want to be. If you are a low gross margin business, below 40% gross margin, your minimum is 15. My target is 20. And my stretch is 25, but that is profit as a percentage to gross margin, not to revenue. And we've got a lot of clients that are below that 40% gross margin that make a lot of money, because we've taught them to understand it's not about your percent to revenue. It is about your percentage of profit to gross margin. And so the key is you got to understand which group you fall in. So a lot of our construction contractors, we've given them a lot of clarity, because construction is a classic pass-through of materials and subs. And so they fall into that below 40% gross margin group. And so we want to look at them as profit to gross margin, businesses, and minimum 15, targets 20, and 25 is when you're cooking.
Awesome. Well, episode 3 is a wrap. We appreciate you all today, and thanks for listening. We'll be coming soon with episode 4. So stay tuned and leave us a great review. Have a good one.
If you want to know more about driving sustainable profitability for your business, or are interested in learning more about CRI Simple Numbers, please visit our website at simplenumberscri.com. Thanks for listening to this episode of Profitability Playbook, the Simple Numbers Podcast. You can subscribe to Profitability Playbook on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you prefer to listen to podcasts. If you liked what you heard today, please leave us a review. The views expressed on Profitability Playbook, the Simple Numbers Podcast, are those of the presenter and moderator and do not necessarily reflect the views of CRI Simple Numbers or the CRI family of companies. This podcast is intended for informational and educational purposes only and is not intended to replace professional advice received directly. Consult with your CRI Simple Numbers advisor or another trusted professional if you have questions about your specific situation.